¿Qué es lo que hace que una década sea una década? Es decir, más allá de lo obvio, de lo meramente cronológico, muchas veces estás viendo una serie o viendo una película o leyendo un libro o viendo unas fotos antiguas y sabes reconocer de inmediato que eso pertenece a una época determinada, a una década. Y además, con bastante precisión, puedes decir de qué momento es dentro de esa década. ¿Por qué? A veces por algo tan sencillo como un peinado, o por una forma de llevar los pantalones, o por la música que está sonando de fondo en esos momentos, o por una expresión concreta, o por un modelo de teléfono, de coche o de zapatillas que aparece fugazmente. Y todos esos pequeños algos solo se conforman una generación, una década, una época. Mi invitado de hoy ha escrito un libro muy interesante, un ensayo sobre todos esos pequeños algos que conformaron los 90 y que hicieron de esta década un momento muy especial. Y para averiguar cuáles son esos algos, se va haciendo preguntas. Preguntas que tal vez expliquen modas, formas y maneras de pensar de esa época que ahora a lo mejor nos parecen extrañas, vistos desde el momento actual, pero que en esa época, en esos momentos, en esos días de los 90, nos parecían la cosa más normal del mundo. ¿Cómo pudo ser la película más exitosa? Titanic, que duraba más de 3 horas y todo el mundo sabía cómo iba a acabar. ¿O por qué lo peor que un cantante de los 90, una banda, podía hacer era intentar y demostrar querer tener éxito? ¿O por qué quiso Pepsi sacar una Pepsi transparente y quién en su sano juicio pudo aprobar tal aberración? ¿O por qué lo peor que pudo hacer Clinton era mentir para el ojo del ciudadano común? ¿O por qué cada mes el cantante de country Garth Brooks tiene cientos y cientos y cientos de miles de oyentes en Spotify cuando su música no está en Spotify? ¿O cómo era ver una serie todo el mundo al mismo tiempo y que si te lo perdías, bueno, pues te lo perdías? ¿O lo que era viajar en avión antes del 11S? ¿O por qué Friends a día de hoy sigue teniendo tal éxito? Para hablar de todo esto y de una manera lúcida como todo lo que escribe y sin caer en la nostalgia, voy a hablar con Klosterman, que es el autor del libro Los 90. Además, he tenido el privilegio y el honor de escribirle el prólogo y además es un escritor que leo con gran interés desde hace muchos años porque me parece muy divertida su forma de aproximarse a temas que me interesan como la cultura pop, la música, el cine, el deporte y demás. Esta conversación la podéis encontrar tanto en versión original como en versión doblada. Y espero que os guste este Seagrams tónica transatlántico que nos hemos tomado Klosterman y yo. Él en su cabaña en Oregón y yo en Madrid, como siempre, en el hotel. Y también me gustaría saber qué son esos algos que para vosotros conforman los 90. ¿Cuáles son esas imágenes mentales que vienen a vuestra cabeza cuando pensáis en esta época?
Bienvenidos al Hotel Jorge Juan con Javier Aznar, un podcast de Vanity Fair y Seagrams.
¿Cómo estás, Chuck? Una alegría poder charlar contigo.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Hay una frase en tu libro que me gusta mucho, que es la de el pasado es un vertedero mental. Está lleno de recuerdos de los que nadie se acuerda. Y me gusta un poco ese oxímoron, lo de recuerdos de los que nadie se acuerda. ¿Es así esto?
Yeah, well, okay, I suppose you're saying there's a slight paradox in that, saying how can something be a memory if no one remembers it? But there's also the idea of the freestanding memory that's unattached to anyone's actual mind. I mean, everything is history. I was just talking to someone today over text. He's reading a book about an event that happened in 1977. And, you know, it was huge news in the United States at the time. And yet almost no one even recalls that it happened. So it is a pre-existing memory. Someone is out there remembering it, but most people are not. And that is a real reflection of how the 90s sort of operated, in the sense that it was, you know, at the time, we had never been a more mediated culture. There was more ways to sort of understand reality in terms of, you know, television and magazines and newspapers and books and what seemed like, I mean, doesn't really compare with now, but at the time it seemed as we had this wave of information, but it was very temporary. It was not as easy to access once the present moment had moved on. Whereas now it's like, you know, the internet allows us to follow news from 2 days ago almost as easily, or really not much more easy than it is to follow information from 20 years ago. And that wasn't as much the case in the 90s. In the 90s, everything was available, but it was very temporary. It was ephemeral. So all these things end up being memories for someone, but not for most people. I guess that's what I was reflecting on. Yeah.
Estás muy interesado en una idea o una teoría que es interesante, que es la de la lenta cancelación del futuro.
Yeah, that was a theory by a guy named Mark Fisher, who was sort of a British music writer who was also kind of an anti-capitalist theorist. And it really informed a lot of my thinking in this book, because it does seem sort of like the central issue of the day, which is that all through the 20th century, particularly the last half of the 20th century, the thing that we always discussed was the acceleration of culture. The Douglas Copeland book, the subtitle is, you know, Tales from an Accelerated Culture. It was a real kind of media obsession, the idea that our culture was moving faster. And it seemed as though the internet was going to amplify that and accentuate it. But when the internet became central to life, the opposite seemed to happen. Because we now had access to all information, we stopped discarding things that were ancillary, and it created a kind of stasis. The example I always use, or kind of the metaphor I use, is for the longest time, the time kind of moved almost like a highway, and what you saw out the window of your car was kind of culture. So you would pass culture and then you would move on to a new kind of culture. And if you wanted to go back, you had to stop your car and turn around. Now it is more like the world is a shallow ocean, a very shallow sea that anyone can wade out to with a bucket and pick up anything they want from any period of time. And the result is everything to some degree now is retro. Almost every new film or new piece of music or new book in some ways is connected to either the relatively recent or the relatively distant past. And it's making things much more homogeneous. It seemed as though the internet would splinter culture. And I think it did splinter people's lives. But the ideas we're working with are actually more shared, but not in a good way, in a negative way, in a way that sort of is keeping society from intellectually and emotionally moving. And I kind of feel like this ended to a large degree at the end of the 20th century. Now, coincidentally, that's where my book is set, so maybe, of course, it's going to seem that way. But I do think that there is a real shift in how culture evolved post, 2001.
Este libro no es para nada nostálgico, pero tú al mismo tiempo has dicho alguna vez que escribir, que para ser escritor de cultura y demás, la nostalgia puede ser algo peligrosa o tramposa. ¿Cómo te llevas con la nostalgia? Porque este libro no es nada nostálgico, pues habla de los 90, pero al mismo tiempo tienes que mirar hacia atrás y pensar en toda esa época y en todo eso que pudiste vivir.
Well, yeah, in some ways, this is sort of a semantic issue, right? I view this book as almost being anti-nostalgia. I think a lot of people like the book for nostalgic reasons. Well, how can that be? Well, it has to do with your sort of meaning of that word. For a lot of people, I think nostalgia just means remembering something that they had a personal experience with, that they remember something and it's history now, but they can remember the experience when it was, happening for the first time. But that's not actually what nostalgia means, or at least not to me. To me, what nostalgia means is looking back on something, injecting your emotional memory of the event, and then remembering the actual event differently. This is why people can look back at a period of their life that was bad and suddenly kind of remember it in a positive, charming way. Because what they're really doing is injecting back their understanding that experience changed who they were, or made them a different kind of person, or taught them about life. And now they experience that through the memory of, the thing that they were going through. This book doesn't do that so much. In some of my other books, my earlier work, I do talk about the 90s as they applied to me specifically, like my memory of things and how those things impacted me. This time I'm more detached. I was trying to sort of reflect the way the 90s felt in a more objective way. There's, of course, some subjective elements. That's an impossible thing to escape. But I tried to keep my emotions out of my memory of these things. In criticism, nostalgia tends to have a negative connotation. It seems it's like to like a music critic, for example. If you really like a record from the early 90s because it was your favorite record in high school, they're like, well, that's kind of a cheap way to adore it. You're basically saying that it's a good feeling memory to you, so therefore you're making the art feel positive. And I understand that. Although at the same time, that also seems like the greatest thing art could do, is sort of make someone remember the best parts of their own life. It would seem like if you're an artist and what you kept doing was making music that made people remember the best parts of their life, you would be a pretty good citizen.
Hay una parte que me encanta que hablas de que los 90 lo peor que uno podía ser era ser un vendido.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting me doing this podcast for like an audience in Spain, because in the United States, the term sellout has almost completely disappeared. Now, I don't even know if it was ever part of the lexicon in Spain. It probably was, but I don't know that. In the 90s, though, in the United States, it was really kind of a universal, unilateral obsession. That there was this built-in fear to anyone trying to be creative that if they attempted to make their art popular among people who were unlike them, or if they were doing things that seemed to be solely to become a bigger, more successful entity, it was believed to damage that art. And you were selling out. You were selling out to make money, but more so you were selling out your integrity. You were sort of compromising the single-minded vision you had by making it more palatable to strangers who had no relationship to you. Now, it was always weird because even as it was happening, we kind of thought that was ridiculous. It seemed weird to try to write a book and not have it be popular, or to try to make a movie and not have people see it. It made no sense. And yet it was still an essential component to the presentation. It really was kind of psychologically damaging thing for people of the 90s. I mean,
Sí, tenía que parecer que no te esforzabas.
Yeah.
Y, por ejemplo, también, si luego ves el documental sobre el famoso concierto de Woodstock 99,
sure,
se puede percibir muy bien eso, como la gente, los artistas que salían ahí estaban obsesionados con criticar a las estrellas del pop del momento y acusarles de vendidos cuando ellos hacían prácticamente lo mismo.
Well, okay, we're talking about the Woodstock 99 situation for people who are unfamiliar with this. There was an attempt to sort of recreate the original Woodstock event, and it was just a complete disaster. And there was it was just kind of in some ways, some people would say sort of like the end of 90s culture. What you understand about that, or what I kind of view that as, is there were kind of two periods of the 90s. There was the first half up through about 1994, 95, really from I guess you could say from the release of Nirvana's Nevermind until Kurt Cobain killed himself. That's like the first part of the 90s, and that's what we usually think about when we kind of caricature that period. The second half of the 90s was different, even though a lot of those early 90s values were still sort of present, but they were now oddly commodified. So when you see a lot of those bands playing at Woodstock in 1999, they're there to make as much money as possible, to play to the widest possible audience, but they still needed to sort of have the trappings of people who were uninterested in fame. I mean, that is the thing about, 90s psychology. And here again, it's not every single person who lived through that period, but for a large chunk of the young populace of the 90s, it was this fear of trying to seem aspirant, of trying to seem like you have some desire to be loved by people you'll never meet. And that was seen as the saddest possible thing.
Hay una cosa también muy interesante en el libro que hablas de cómo lo que ahora nos parece raro, en su día no lo veíamos para nada raro. Y pasa con los 90, ¿no? Es más, lo que nos parece ahora raro, en su día era algo más que normal y hasta predecible.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I have a whole book about this called But What If We're Wrong? Where I wrote this came out, 5 years ago, or maybe now more than 5 years ago now. That book, But What If We're Wrong, was an attempt to think about the present tense, as if it was the distant past. So the way we think about, say, the 1850s, how will the moment right now appear to people that far in the future? What aspects of our culture will seem absurd or impossible? I think it's a real important question, because what tends to happen is, and I'm to blame for this as much as anyone else. It's human nature. You look back on the past, and all you see are the things that went wrong, the things that were foolish, the things that contradict what we know now, but always operating from the position that knowledge has stopped, that what we know now is as much as we will ever know. And that is not the case. So, I mean, there are probably some things about the world right now that seem so central to our existence that you and I can't even come up with the question. Like things that seem so obvious that we all seem to understand to be true that will seem false in the future. And that's a hard thing to accept. It's hard to accept the idea that something that seems so obvious now that we wouldn't question it because it would make us seem like a lunatic to do so will be an example of collective lunacy in the future. I think about that a lot.
¿Y tienes algún ejemplo?
Well, I mean, I'm always hesitant to do that. I'm always hesitant to make predictions, but I can certainly something like, right now when somebody has cancer, they get chemotherapy, right? Essentially, we put a poison in their body to take out the cancer. I can believe that in 100 years, when there's, we do a different kind of genetic medicine, that will seem not unlike bloodletting or something, or using leeches to cure disease or whatever. Like, it will just seem crazy that we poisoned people on purpose. But right now, it is the best way we have to fight cancer. So we do it, and not only do we do it, but we see it almost as, as like a brilliant leap forward. I don't know exactly what parts will seem sensible and what parts will seem crazy, but I assume even in 10 years, certain aspects about the way we dealt with the pandemic is going to seem just unfathomable to certain people. And maybe in 50 years, for people who have yet to be born, they won't even accept that the decisions we made happened.
Aquí tenemos la tradición con Vanity Fair de hacer el cuestionario Proust.
Sure.
Este es un poco adaptado, pero será divertido. Te lo voy a hacer.
Okay, let's do it.
¿Cuál es tu idea de felicidad perfecta?
Well, I suppose if I'm being totally honest, I don't believe there is such a thing, because if you were in a state of of perfect happiness, it would almost sort of suggest you're detached from reality. That something has happened to your mind. You can have moments though that feel happy. I mean, just laying in bed with my kids is, especially in the morning. Say it's a Saturday morning, and it's raining, and there's nothing to do, and we just kind of laying in bed together watching television. Seems like all of the things that I have done in my life have kind of led to that point. I mean, that's close, But to be totally honest, if even as that happened, my mind would be worrying about things. I don't think I'm ever happy. I don't know if I've ever been happy in my life.
Un rasgo que no te guste de ti mismo.
I guess the fear that there is something incredibly unlikable and annoying about myself that everyone realizes but me. It's like, I guess a lack of self-understanding in a way. That's what I worry about. Yeah.
¿Cuál es el rasgo que más deploras en los demás?
Self-righteousness. Yeah.
¿Qué persona de los 90 encontraste más interesante sobre el que escribir o leer durante tu proceso?
Let's see. I really enjoyed writing about Ross Perot, who I'm guessing is completely unknown in Spain. He was a third-party candidate who ran for the presidency in 1992, and I think reflects something very strange about the way Americans looked at the world at that time. I mean, that's the whole thing with this book. I mean, I'm glad it came out in Spain. I feel, though, the title of the book, the Spanish version, should almost be The American 90s. Because I can imagine someone from Spain reading this book and they're like, why isn't he talking about anything that was happening here? But it was just impossible. Like, I couldn't talk about every society that was happening during that period, so it's really hyper-focused on the 90s, but and in the United States,
Sí, pero... Por ejemplo, cuando hablas de Garth Brooks, aquí no fue muy grande, pero tenemos el equivalente.
I suppose I'm not surprised that Garth Brooks wasn't huge in Spain. I mean, he was really the biggest artist of the 90s here, but I'm not shocked. When I was a senior in high school, this is back in North Dakota, in this real rural area, we had a foreign exchange student from Spain. And I will always remember this.
Oh, really?
So we meet the guy, and I was really into heavy metal. I was really a big heavy metal fan, but I was like, so what kind of music? Who are the big artists in Spain? And he's like, the same people who are big here. Madonna, Motley Crue, Halloween. And I was like, what? Halloween? It's like,
yeah,
but I guess that
course.
was but he was just kind of listing, like everybody he was listing were these canonical universal artists, and he just kind of threw Halloween in there, and I remember being like, wow,
Yeah.
But that's just, that's how it is. It was like I was too young to realize that should not be surprising.
Una virtud que consideres sobrevalorada.
Probably, I think it's people who like to tell you how hard they work and like to talk about their work ethic. Because they're not what they're really trying to do, I think, is not really say anything about them is so great, but suggest people around them are lazy. I guess that doesn't mean much to me. If someone brags about their work ethic, I'm never impressed. Well, I don't know. I think that I think everyone assumes they're working hard, right? You either assume you're working hard or you're down on yourself for being lazy. But it's not some kind of thing that we all share, right? There's no amount of work that you do, and if you do it, you're a hard worker, and if you don't, you're not. It's all sort of relative to how the person views the world. So it's kind of it's not that different as someone bragging about how smart they are, but you don't see that as much. People are less willing to do that because it seems egocentric, but they will claim that they work hard because somehow that almost seems self-deprecating, that their success is not based on how smart they are or how talented they are, but that they've kind of ground it out, kind of made it happen. And that's very often false. Yeah.
El primer CD o álbum que te compraste con tu propio dinero.
It was Billy Joel's An Innocent Man. And I had to get half the money. I paid for half and my sister paid for half.
En la primera película que fuiste a ver 2 veces al cine.
Oh. First movie I ever saw in a theater was The Empire Strikes Back. The first movie I saw twice in a theater? That's a real good question.
Yeah.
Because, I came from a real rural area. It was hard to see movies. And it was, and so it was rare to go to a movie theater twice to see it. I saw the movie Clerks 3 times in the theater. But, I'm sure that wasn't the first movie I saw twice, but I do remember I saw that one 3 times, like in the span of a week and a half.
Yeah, ¿has visto la nueva?
Nope. I think if I saw the original Clerks, it might seem terrible to me. I haven't watched it in a long time, but when it came out, it was a big deal. It seemed like it was just, it was, I was a younger person at the time, but just, I had never seen a movie like that seemed as though it was a movie I could have made. Yeah.
Pero son interesantes las películas de Kevin Smith.
Well, it was the language of the movie. The fact that it did not seem like someone had written a script and had 15 other people read it and shaped it into something that would like widen the audience. It was like he wrote this script and that was it. It was just him. That was one thing that I really like about, 90s filmmaking, whether it's Kevin Smith, but even more so like Richard Linklater and Slacker and Quentin Tarantino, and then later, David Fincher and P.T. Anderson and some of these people that, Spike Lee was like this. The movies did seem like a singular, specific reflection of their mindset. That it was, in the 1980s, movies have been kind of made more in the studio system, where there was almost a formula to make a movie that could be successful. And we kind of see this again after Titanic. But there was this gap in between where the idea of a movie that wasn't about even society. It was more about the way the director viewed the world. I really like that period of film. Yeah.
¿Qué no te gustaba de tu apariencia en los 90? Y si recuerdas algo.
Oh, well, I made them all. Every bad choice I made, probably. I was very much the cliche of a Gen X person. Like, I wore my baseball hat backwards. I wore flannel all the time. I never dressed up for anything. I would do. I got this little plastic bunny head that came as like an ice cream promotion, and I wore it as a necklace for like 6 months. It was so I would just the only, people will say like, what qualifies you to write about, an entire decade? And, the real answer is nothing. No one's qualified, therefore everyone's qualified. But the one thing I will say is that I was completely immersed in the stupidest things about the 90s. Like, I was all the way in on that stuff. Because I graduated from high school in 1990, and, so essentially the decade ends when I'm 28 or 29. The part of your life when you're an adult, but you're still an idiot, that was the 90s for me. Yeah.
¿Cuándo y dónde fuiste más feliz en los 90?
Oh, well, the last semester I was at college, that was a real great time. Because, I had essentially already graduated. I was just kind of playing out the last semester. I was extremely close with my friends. In that way, you can only really be close, you're 22 or 21. The intensity of those, that's, I read about the TV show Friends in this book, and I think part of the reason Friends continues to be a successful show, and I'm guessing it's probably shown around the world, is because it captures this thing that is universal, which is that period of life in between being a teenager and being a full-on adult, where your friends matter more than your family. And that was true for me at the end of college. I also had some real good times living in Fargo when I was working at the newspaper there. Really had kind of a heavy drinking period, but it was a fun time. You know, I met people who I'm still close friends with. In general, the 90s were a happy time for me, and I think for a lot of people. I mean, we didn't think so while it was going on. During the 90s, there was this just constant sense that life is underwhelming and that, well, it's okay now, but it's like maybe it'll be better later, or maybe we missed out on the 1970s when things were really happening or whatever. Now, looking back on the 90s, it would be great to take a vacation back to that period because the stakes kind of were lower. It just did not seem as though life was always on the precipice of collapse, which is all we're reminded about now. I mean, like in the United States, every time there's an election, it doesn't even have to be a presidential election. It can be an off-year election. We are incessantly told this is the most important election of your life. What happens in this election is going to dictate the future going forward like a row of dominoes. In the 1996 presidential election, no one said that. It didn't seem that big of a deal. Like, it seems like, well, you know, it's like, I think our voter turnout was less than 50% that time, you know, and nobody thought that it was a huge tragedy. I mean, it's like there was, life seemed less fragile than it does now. Now everything seems like too important to a degree that you almost become numb to it. That people tell you about important things and you don't even take it seriously because you know you were told something was super important yesterday and something different is going to be explained to you as super important tomorrow. Like the things that we thought were boring in the 90s were actually great.
Y hablando de Friends, ¿cuál dirías que fue tu sitcom favorita de los 90?
Seinfeld. Seinfeld was my favorite sitcom from that period. I was one of the people who thought, yeah, like when Friends debuted, it was the rival show was a show here called My So-Called Life, which was a very kind of Gen X-y show about a teenage girl, you know, and that's the show I watched. I didn't watch Friends at the time, but then when I would visit my friends from college, they liked Friends so much that, you know, they would tape it and we'd watch it on the weekend or whatever. And now I've seen all those episodes. Seinfeld, I thought, was the best show from that period. It just sort of, I think, not only reflected my sense of humor, but kind of the sense of humor that sort of defines that period of time. The biggest thing, though, which is an interesting thing to say, but it is true. I write a lot about TV in this book. TV was the dominant medium of the 90s. But compared to now, TV wasn't very good during that period. Like it was perceived as much less important than film. And, you know, like now, you know, we're always recording television shows and there's, you know, you can't talk about a television show in front of people because you'll spoil what's going to happen. People build their whole relationships around binging certain kind of shows. That wasn't how it was in the 90s. Like Seinfeld was a popular show that I loved, but if I missed it, I just missed it. Like I never thought to myself, I got to find a way to see that episode I missed. That just wasn't how it was. You just moved on. It was kind of embarrassing to like TV that much. It was much more common for people to say they didn't own a TV, you know?
¿Qué talento te gustaría tener?
I wish I could play piano or guitar. That would be great. Piano specifically. I think that'd be a really satisfying thing, but I can't play any instruments. Yeah. I can't swim. I wish I could swim. Like I never learned how to swim. When I was growing up, I never had the opportunity to learn how to swim. So now my kids can swim, and I take them to the swimming pool, and I'm in the swimming pool with them, and I'm always like, God damn it, I hope they don't start drowning because I'm going to drown saving them. Like I will die because I'll have to. I can't just watch them drown, right? I'll have to try to save them, and then I will die too. So that's always kind of a bummer about going to the swimming pool. Yeah.
And ¿dónde te gustaría haber vivido fuera de Estados Unidos?
Where would I like to live outside of the U.S.? You know, in the United States, we have almost kind of a glamorized idea of what it's like to live in Scandinavia. It's become this sort of political thing that like the dream of the United States would be to be like Sweden or Norway. I don't know if that's actually true, although they do seem like okay places to live. I spent some time in Italy, and I did like I liked being there, but I don't think I'd want to live in Italy. France, I didn't really enjoy my time that much in France. But I was there during a bad time of the year. The weather was bad. I actually had a very good time in New Zealand. I could imagine living in New Zealand in a way. Because I'll just be honest, like I'm an extraordinarily American person. Like I have American sensibilities. I like American things. When I was over in Germany, I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to find ways to watch professional basketball games in America on my computer. Like I was constantly trying to watch these NBA games at 3:00 in the morning. Like there's all these things. Where I lived in Germany, like the food there is really good, and yet I would kind of crave going to the one McDonald's. So I'm an American person. So like New Zealand's probably the most like the United States in terms of, unless you count Canada. So that's probably what it would be. I don't think I would thrive living in a different country. I would miss living here.
Yeah, pero eres de Dakota y vives en Oregon. Yeah, well, no puedes quejarte del tiempo.
Well, I came from North Dakota where the weather could not be worse. It is, obviously the winters are insane, but also the summers are incredibly hot. I lived in New York, and in New York, it's like, because of all the pavement and the urban nature of it, and because you're so close to the water, it's kind of like super hot and uncomfortable and sweaty and disgusting in the summer. And then in the winter, it's not as cold as North Dakota, but you're always walking around. Like in North Dakota, you're always in a car. I lived in Ohio. The weather there was actually pretty good. And now living here in Portland, I like it. Okay, I love rain. So I don't mind having half the year be constantly rainy, except now I got a fucking dog. So now whenever it rains, I know I got to take the dog out in the rain. Like, it's like, I have a steel roof on my house. And when it rains all during the winter, I wake up and I hear this wonderful sort of sound of the water hitting the steel roof. Now I'm like, I got to take the dog out. Like the dog has taken away my ability to enjoy the weather. Yeah.
Pero entonces, tu famosa pregunta de qué preferirías entre un ataque de un oso grizzly a un amigo o vivir siempre bajo la lluvia, ya lo has decidido.
Exactly.
¿Cuál es tu posesión más preciada, esa que sobrevive a todo tipo de mudanzas?
I have a bunch of physical photographs from the period before the iPhone. Now everyone has a camera on their phone. It's very, I've taken more pictures of my kids than that would take, like every month I take more pictures of my kids. It was like taken of me for the first 10 years of my life. And that's not an exaggeration. But these pictures I have of my friends, and I guess this kind of fits in because they're from the 90s. These are photographs from the 90s. Those are really valuable to me because they are one of a kind. I have these photos and no one else does. When I have old friends come over, they love looking through these photo albums because it's not like looking on Facebook and finding these things. These are the only images of, they're like the only copies of these. So that is real valuable to me. Yeah. But lots of things. I like to, I'm the kind of person who likes to keep things. It's like I have T-shirts from high school. That I still have because the T-shirt reminds me and connects me back to the things I did at that period. So I'm as much as I try to fight nostalgia, like I am an inherently nostalgic person. Like I'm always thinking about the past and the future. I'm never thinking about the present.
Murakami escribió un libro sobre su colección de camisetas.
Yes, I know. I thought I have that. I mean, it's interesting reading those Murakami books too, because of course they're being translated from Japanese into English. So his writing style is very unique, but I'm never sure if it's him or the translation. I mean, either way it works. Like, I like it either way, but I always wonder, like, what it would be like to read his books in his natural language. Yeah.
¿Y tu mayor arrepentimiento en los 90?
My greatest regret during the 90s. Well, in a sense, I worry that, like, would I change anything about the way my life was at that time? Because I'd be afraid that somehow that would change my life now. Like, if I'd made a different decision,
the butterfly effect.
I think that I had a lot of misplaced arrogance and misplaced insecurity. That I was too confident about some things and not confident enough about others. And I think that particularly in terms of, like, my romantic life during that period, that caused a lot of chaos for me that I could have avoided, And I wish I'd just been more open-minded, It's I think that, the experience of living through the 90s kind of incrementally opened my mind over, those 10 years. And I kind of wish I could have started where I was at the end. But if that's kind of like saying, well, I wish I knew the things then I knew now, everybody feels that way. Yeah.
¿Tu ocupación o hobby favorito cuando no estás escribiendo?
My favorite hobby or my favorite occupation?
Yeah, like hobby, yeah.
Yeah. The weird thing is, I don't have a ton of hobbies. I watch sports, I watch movies, I play with my kids. Nothing that would surprise you. That's the thing. That is the thing. Like I don't think there's a lot of things about my life that someone who's read all my books would be surprised about. I mean, I've written 12 books now, and in some ways I've just written one book, and they're all this one long book. And I think that somebody wants to understand what I'm like, if you read all 12 of my books, you'd have a better understanding than I do, because I've forgotten some of the stuff about that early period of my life. I mean, I wrote this book, Fargo Rock City. It came out in 2001. It was really kind of it's about hard rock music, but also sort of a memoir of, like, my life growing up. And so, I wrote that now over 25 years ago almost. So somebody will read that book and they'll come up to me and they'll be like, hey, do you still think this? Or, you said this about, Guns N' Roses or whatever. Do you still believe that? And I'm always like, seems like something I might have said. I don't know. I never go back and read my work. Like I read it thousands of times, or at least hundreds of times while I'm writing it. But once it's published, I never go back. So it's almost like people who read my early books are like reading Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. You understand me as a 29-year-old more than I do. Because when I think of myself as a 29-year-old, all I'm doing is taking my current self and projecting it back onto someone who kind of looks like me, but they don't have a beard. Maybe they're not so fat. It's like I somehow think when I was 29, I was like the person I am now, when I clearly was not. I was a totally different person.
En uno de tus libros, en el de Fargo, escribes que tus días favoritos son los que son muy fríos, pero con sol. Yeah. Y cuando estoy en invierno en Madrid y hace un día así, pienso, uno de esos días de Chuck Klosterman.
Well, it's that very deceptive thing where visually it seems warm and tangibly it feels cold. And I like that dissonance. I also really like when it's sunny out and raining. I always think that's cool. That's more cliché. Yeah.
¿Tienes un lema en tu vida, algo que repitas o que tengas presente?
I don't. I should. Because I think those things are valuable. But when I give talks to colleges, for example, or when I was in Germany teaching creative writing, one thing that I get asked a lot about is, like, do you have any rituals when you write? Like, you go at a certain time, or you do a certain thing, and I don't have those. But I always wonder, if I made something up, would other people do it? Like if I said, before I start writing books, I stare at a picture of a parrot for 10 minutes. Then I smoke a cigarette and I put the cigarette out on the parrot's beak, and then I go to work. Like, would people be like, I'm going to try that? I always think that would be fun to do, like to sort of like start some kind of idiotic trend based on something I made up as a way to answer the question, do you have any writing rituals? When the true answer is, I do not.
Y ya por último, una pregunta que me lleva atormentando mucho tiempo y que he hecho varias veces aquí en el podcast a amigos, a invitados, que está sacada de tus preguntas hiperteóricas que sacaste hace tiempo, en las que hacías preguntas así que te hacían un poco devanarte la cabeza. Y una de ellas era, ¿qué prefieres? Si tienes para elegir entre dos opciones. Una, ir a la luna 5 minutos, y la otra es poder viajar varios meses por toda Europa con los gastos pagados mensuales de 3.000 o 5.000 euros, pongamos. ¿Y qué prefieres? Y la gente responde en función de sus sueños, aspiraciones, intereses, y siempre me ha parecido interesante hacer esta pregunta.
Well, one thing that is interesting about that question, those are like 50 questions, and some of them actually came out of real conversations I would have with people. A few of them I just made up for that deck of cards. This was one where I used to actually kind of, something I would say on dates when I was talking to a woman or whatever. What's interesting about that question, to me at least, is not what my answer would be, because I can tell you what it is if you care, but almost every man says the moon, and almost every woman says Europe, almost every time. I would also say the moon. And I think it's just because it's like this experience that, I think like 13 people in the history of the world have had or whatever. It can never be replicated. The other one, it seems like you could do. If you really just wanted to, you could just save up money and do it. And I think that guys a lot of times feel this obligation. I don't even know if it's true, but they feel this obligation to pick the thing that they could never do on their own. Whereas a woman is more practical and is like, what would 10 minutes on the moon get me? Like, why would I do that? But I would take the moon. Well, do you have an answer to this?
I will take the year abroad because I'm not that interested in going, to the moon. Like, I'm not that, but I fully agree that every man usually answers the moon option.
I mean, that's with all those questions, one of the most interesting. I mean, I'm never interested in what the specific answer is. I'm always more interested in the way the person goes about it. Okay, because if someone gets asked those weird hypothetical questions, there's a kind of person who's like, "That's stupid. Don't waste my time." And I know that I'm not going to be friends with this person. But the one thing that is interesting is when you see trends, like when you see questions where men tend to answer one way and women tend to answer a different way, or all older people say something while younger people say something different. That makes me think that was a good question, because it must be tapping into something outside of one's own mind, and in sort of the collective idea that we're socialized to see the world in a certain way. And I think maybe men are socialized to believe that if you can go to the moon, do it.
Okay, Chuck. Thank you very much for this chat.
Hey, thanks for writing that thing. Thanks for writing the prologue to my book. That was very cool of you.
A pleasure.
Okay.
An honor.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chuck.
Bye.
Thank you.